Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thanks for coming. My name is Maz Jamaspi. I am a fractional marketing consultant and also a co-host of a podcast we call Being Moved My Marketing. And I'm going to introduce you also to my co-host, Sabina. Go ahead and take it from there.
Yeah, so my name is Sabina Iyengar. I'm also the co-host of Who Moved My Marketing. It's literally a 15-minute podcast on different marketing trends that are out there. So if you guys don't have time for a full 60 minutes, you can kind of get an idea of what's happening. We wanted to first thank our hosts, EM Marketing, for bringing us here. EM is elevating the hiring process through a highly specialized, highly curated, and higher touch approach built on the human connection. So it's interesting because Maz and I have been a part of this EM community for a few years now. We actually met at a different event very similar to this, and now we're coming full circle and we're meeting with Thomas. So, we feel very much, an honor to be here today. With that, Maz, do you want to introduce our speaker?
Yeah, it's my pleasure to introduce Thomas Smith. Thomas is a Johns Hopkins trained AI and marketing expert. He has served as OpenAI's beta tester before ChatGPT was launched. And he's been called a veteran programmer by New York Times for his work in human in the loop AI. He's been featured in Wall Street Journal, IEEE Spectrum, and also he contributes a weekly column at Fast Company on the topic of generative AI. So welcome, Thomas.
Thanks for having me. Yeah, thrilled to be here.
Excellent. So, okay, let's get started with a very easy question first, right? Can you give us an overview of what is happening in terms of the transition from traditional search, so SEO, versus AI search, so there's GEO, AEO, why should we pay attention to it, and what are the differences between all of this?
Yeah, so I think when you look at the traditional search landscape, it was these 10 blue links right at the top of Google. And we were all kind of competing and trying to get one of those links, ideally as high as possible. And that was the paradigm. And there was a lot of work we all did with backlinks and all kinds of different technical things to try to win that top position. And that was the paradigm for a long time. And that is starting to shift, and dramatically starting to shift away from that model of these kind of classical 10 blue links towards people using chatbots, using ChatGPT, Perplexity, Claude, or even within Google AI overviews to get their information directly. Instead of searching and browsing and looking and going through that process themselves, they're putting their query in and getting a response back. And that shifts how people get information, it shifts how these companies' business models work. And then as marketers, it shifts what we have to do to ensure that our brands and our companies are showing up in those chatbots, that we're being recommended, that we're being talked about. So the SEO, search engine optimization, sort of the original acronym, we have a lot of new acronyms that are coming along. So GEO is Generative Engine Optimization, and that's basically getting into these generative AI-powered chatbots. So again, ChatGPT, Perplexity, Claude, all of the ones that people are using. There's also AEO is another acronym that sort of flies around. It's very similar. It's answer engine optimization, very similar to GEO. Sometimes it's used interchangeably. The only difference I would say is it's sort of oriented more towards that idea that instead of putting out a search and then you're sort of browsing and looking, that you're getting an answer. And so chatbots generally answer your question, but there's other ways that, for example, Google might answer your question directly. A snippet, people also ask a question, you might see those below the results. So answer engine optimization is generally GEO, generative engine optimization, getting in the chatbots, paired with trying to show up on those other, what we call surfaces, other places that kind of answer-oriented results instead of the 10 blue links are showing up. AIO is another one. There's two different ways people define that. One is AI overviews, which is if you've put a query into Google recently, you'll see that at this point, almost half of queries, instead of having the 10 blue links, actually have an AI overview, an AI generated result that just gives you your answer at the top of Google. obviously, as marketers, we'd like to be in that answer. So that's AI overviews. And it can also be AI optimization. So optimizing for this whole new paradigm of AI-powered search. I personally like GEO because I think it's the most direct. What are these? They're generative engines instead of search engines. They generate and respond with information.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, so let's get a little more detailed about the actual solutions. So in the article that you wrote in Fast Company, you had talked about the specifics, and you referred to 3 pillars of GEO. Can you talk specifically about those pillars?
Yeah, so this is sort of where the rubber meets the road. Like, how do you actually get into these answer engines, generative engines, whatever you want to call them? And yeah, what I found is that there's sort of, like you said, 3 pieces to it. The first is technical. So these are still systems that are going and crawling your website. They're looking at the information that you've published. And if you're not presenting that in a way that they can easily read, then they will ignore you, or they may even return the wrong information when they answer somebody's question about your brand. And there's a lot of nuance to it, but there can be really obvious mistakes that people make. One that I've seen is that there's a file on most web pages, probably most of you here are familiar, called robots.txt. And in the early days of chatbots, a lot of people actually went and had their technical folks change their robots.txt to exclude the crawlers from ChatGPT and from all these other places, thinking, I don't want them stealing my content, right? Why give them access to my content? So they're blocking these crawlers. And if you did that 2-3 years ago now at this point and forgot, you might actually be blocking the same crawler that's there to learn about your brand and tell your customers about it. And the LLM, the companies that make these large language models that drive these things, are pretty good at getting around that. But if you block them, then that's going to hurt your positioning. So there's very fundamental technical things. There's also more complex ones. A good example is something called schema. Again, if you've ever done technical SEO work, you might be familiar with it. It's basically structured machine readable data that doesn't show up to a person, but that describes you, your company, what's on a page, and connects you to your social profiles from your website, for example, in a way that a machine can read. And in a traditional search context, it was useful, but not super important. In a GEO context, these large language models rely much more heavily on that kind of schema and structured data. So it can be a pretty quick win and a pretty big win to do that well. And certainly if you're doing it poorly and you're sending them off on a wild goose chase, it's very important to fix that. So technical is the first piece, the first pillar there. The second one, and I think where people in this space tend to get more excited, is content. And what I like to tell people is that LLMs are pattern recognizers that have been trained on human language. So that means that they love stories, they love narratives, they love structure in terms of words and entities. And what are we as marketers pretty good at, hopefully? Storytelling. This is fundamental to marketing and always has been. So to a much greater extent than with the traditional search engine, these GEO kind of systems listen to narrative. And so the story that you tell about yourself on your own webpage, and the story you tell about your brand, your origin, the people in your company, the products that you have, is incredibly important in terms of influencing the stories that these chatbots will then tell to your customers or users who ask. And it's actually amazing to me how, some people would say gullible LLMs are, these large language models are at this particular moment. Because the search engines have learned, hey, if we give people the chance to describe their own brand, they're going to describe it in glowing ways. And so we're not going to really pay much attention to that. And that's where we got, metrics like links and domain authority and all that to determine our positioning in traditional search. LLMs are much more sensitive to these narratives that we tell about ourselves, to the point where people have even tricked them. There's a classic journalist who described himself on his academic website as a time traveler. And lo and behold, Claude started referring to him as a time traveler. Oh. So that's a kind of an extreme example, but it shows that they're paying attention. So if you can tell a consistent story about you, about your brand, about your products, about the people in your company, that relates together and that uses consistent language. And remember, these LLMs, these models don't have access necessarily to the same kinds of links that a traditional search engine would have used to understand how information relates. They're really looking mostly at words. And so if you refer to yourself in multiple different ways, in different places, it can be very hard for these models to understand that you're referring to the same thing and how these different entities, we call them, relate together. So telling a consistent story on your own platforms that you control about your company with consistent entities using the same names, the same structure, all of that, again, goes a surprisingly long way towards influencing the stories that these systems then repeat. So you tell that story well on your own site, ChatGPT crawls it and picks it up, and then somebody asks that chatbot about your brand, it's very likely to repeat that exact story that you told about yourself. So content is very, very important. And the final one is brand. So again, we saw this in the traditional search landscape, that your brand and positioning was important, but search engines often kind of struggle to know how to understand a brand and what made a good brand versus a bad brand. And LLMs, the models behind these things, are able to access a lot more about you, and they can learn what people say about you. They can learn what reviews you've gotten in different places. They can learn what press coverage you've had. Is it legitimate? Is it not legitimate? And they essentially form an opinion within what we call their world knowledge, the training that they have about how the world works, of you and your brand. And basically by doing good branding, by doing PR and showing up in legitimate publications, being in directories that mention things related to your industry, even speaking in an event like this will show up within the knowledge base of these large language models. That all helps to establish credibility, helps them to learn about who you are. So again, technical, content, and brand. And you realize many of these things are things that work in traditional marketing and in SEO as well. So it's not a new thing, but again, there's subtle nuances of how to do it right for GEO.
So let's continue with that, because you're talking about all of these components. What are the components for ranking high with GEO? How do we specifically score higher? Now, you and I were also talking about this earlier about, we've had paid SEO. Mm-hmm. Are we getting into paid GEO as well now, right? So first, we're trying to get in front of everyone and get ourselves in the actual answers. But at the same time, can you kind of help us figure out how do we rank higher organically? And then is there going to be a component of, paid as well with this?
Yeah, so two pieces to the ranking. One is that most of these large language models, most of these systems that we use, and I kind of use the term chatbot and large language model interchangeably because one powers the other. Most of them rely on some kind of search index. And it depends on the company, what they use, but there is a traditional search component that drives the baseline for a lot of these systems. So ranking well in traditional search and the things you would do to rank well there can help you to appear for these models when a query comes up. And if you do that poorly, then you're much less likely to show up, because again, a lot of their starting point is often a traditional search index. The other thing though with these models in particular is that it's not as standardized as a traditional search. In the old paradigm, there was one search result page for a given query. If I put in best marketing agency in Redwood City, then, hopefully EM marketing would be right there at the top. That's what everybody would see. With chatbots, they have memory about the person conversing with them. They have live data through another acronym I'll throw out is a system called retrieval augmented generation. That means that these large language models have learned about the world, but they can also grab live data when you put your query in. If you see ChatGPT thinking, that usually means it's accessing these pieces of data externally. So each conversation is different, and what it chooses to surface may depend on what just showed up in the news, or it might depend on what query that person asked to Perplexity or to Claude, a week ago, what's going on in their life. So one of the things that I think is interesting and challenging for marketers about generative engine optimization is there's far fewer metrics, and it's much harder to quantify than traditional search. Traditional search, you knew if you were winning, you knew who was winning. If you weren't winning, this is much less quantifiable. And to marketers, that can be scary, right? We want to have a number, we want to have a KPI we can improve, we want to be able to justify budget for these things. I encourage people to think of it more along the lines of how you would do almost like a traditional brand work or display advertising versus advertising that's intended to drive direct conversions. You have Coca-Cola has to be out there and get its name out there. A company might sponsor an event or might, get naming rights for a stadium. How do you exactly quantify the way that that impacts sales? It's very challenging to do. And at this particular moment with these chatbots, we're at that same point where they might be talking to your customers about you and telling them to buy from you or not. And you may have zero visibility into that. And what you might see if they're saying, yes, this is a great product, yes, this is a great company, is just somebody showing up through a direct route. Or if you're selling a product, it might come through, they might go to Amazon once ChatGPT says, buy this thing from this company. So attribution at this moment is very hard. And so even the traditional concept of ranking, it's very difficult because it's so much more tailored to the user in the moment. And so, yeah, I encourage people to think of it as almost the top of your funnel at this point. A lot of the research people do when they're considering a large purchase or even a trip or anything at this point is to ask ChatGPT or plug it into Google and they get an AI overview. You may not see the sale or results from that, but that doesn't mean that that didn't drive the customer to make that purchasing decision.
Awesome.
Did you have any comments about the paid?
Oh yeah, so the paid side of things. So this is actually really fascinating. Yesterday, so this is literally hot off the presses kind of news, Google began to experiment with paid results within the AI overviews. So now when you put a question into the Google and you get an AI overview, you get an informational response, and then you might get a paid component at the bottom of it, essentially. And the way that they're doing it is very interesting. So it's not just for commercial queries like, best e-bike or something like that. It's actually showing up for things like if I put in how to sear a steak, it'll give me a long informational AI-powered write-up about how to sear a steak. And then at the end, it'll say, and if you're looking for a great skillet to use to sear a steak, here's a cast iron skillet. And you might want to consider that because cast iron is great for searing a steak. And that's a paid edition. You'll see it has a sponsored, very tiny sponsored flag above it. And that's brand new as of yesterday. And again, it's very interesting because it's not just contextual ad. It actually is using their chatbot essentially to understand what the user is looking for and then serve them something that may not be exactly what they were searching for, but that somehow facilitates or helps that informational side. So the takeaway for marketers there is that if this is how Google is handling the paid side, yes, you might decide to pay at some point when they open that up to be included in those AI answers. But also it shows that the way that they're selecting what to put into the AI overviews is probably based a lot on, again, the stories that we tell about the product itself. And so for that cast iron skillet example, it seemed like the reason that showed up, the specific skillet, this is testing that I did and actually that a company called Bright Edge did and published and shared with me. The way that Google chose that specific skillet was that on its product page, the company that sells it had written a whole long informational piece, essentially, article about how to use it to sear steaks. So Google's LLMs were able to make the connection. And so the lesson for marketers, whether you're doing paid or organic kinds of work in terms of the AI overviews, is that we really can't just put the data about a product on product page anymore. It has to have an informational component. We have to be telling a story about that product, how it's going to help the customer, what it can be used for, even providing useful information. Like, this is the heat you should set this particular skillet on in order to sear a steak with it. And that's going to help, again, these very narrative, very story-driven systems to pair up your product with this user's query, whether that's in a paid or an organic context.
Yeah, in fact, I actually have recommended to people to put a landing page for every product they offer
Yes.
within their entire website. So, but I want to go ahead and kind of change things up a little bit and just ask you a little bit about something that I've been thinking about as well, and that is that a few years ago, I was talking to a startup company, and somewhat of a new brand, and they wanted me to reach out to an agency, an SEO agency, to get their SEO set up and running. And so when I was speaking to the agency, I asked them, well, how long does it take for all of these work that you guys are doing to actually have an impact from an SEO perspective? And they said, well, it'll take you anywhere from 6 months to 12 months. And I think they were being a little bit optimistic, but anyways, that's what the answer was. So if someone did all the things that you recommended for GEO, how long would that take before you can start seeing some serious impact from showing up into AI or in AI engines as being, a source for the information?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it is there's two sides to it. One, it's a lot faster than traditional SEO, and one can be a lot slower, but a lot more impactful. So the faster piece is if you're doing something wrong that's excluding these large language models from reading your website, then fixing that can very quickly elevate you, and they can start to be able to talk about you more. And again, the system of retrieval augmented generation means that there's the way that these models are trained, the things that they learn about the world, and then there's the live data they're going and grabbing. And if you can improve your visibility to them in that live data, even if they haven't learned about you yet, they're more likely to find you and to surface you. And if you can kind of elevate yourself in the traditional search kind of databases that they're pulling from, then you can also appear higher, or it's not even higher at this point, but you can be mentioned more often and more favorably and more accurately just by making those changes. So that's the piece that's faster. The piece that is a lot slower is that, again, these models are pulling live data, but they're also learning about the world, and they have what we call, again, world knowledge. And this is when they're trained, they're shown essentially all of the data that humanity has ever generated, every book, every video. And they learn from all of this data, billions and billions and billions of pieces of data. And they learn how the world works, and your brand presumably will show up somewhere in that data. And if you have told a consistent and accurate and good story about your brand, then through all that learning and connection, the world knowledge of that model will reflect accurate, positive things about your brand. However, if you haven't done that work, or perhaps one of your competitors has done that work for you by making, for example, a comparison page between their brand and your brand, where it really drags your brand through the mud and makes their brand sound great. And again, remember, these models are very gullible, and you haven't done the work to convince the model otherwise, then it can start to learn that you are not a good brand and not a brand that should be recommended. And the problem is that at this point, training one of these models is so expensive and takes such a long time that their world knowledge is only updated sometimes every couple of years at this point. So you can influence the live data that they're pulling relatively quickly, but it might take you a couple of years to convince the model of who you are if you haven't done that work from the beginning. So that's one of the things that I've heard from research engineers at some of the big companies building these models, because people will say, okay, why do I need to do this now? It's still a small amount of traffic. Why get the budget? Why justify it? And what the engineers tell me is, if you can convince the models now of who you are and what your brand does, and that you're good, and here's all the data to back it up, then you can start to kind of appear in that world knowledge as a positive and a good entity. If they start to learn that you are not reputable or that you're just not relevant, you don't show up that much, it's very hard in subsequent training to convince them otherwise. And so that's an argument for doing the work now when these models are still in their relative infancy. You might not see the full results of your work. You'll see a lot of results quickly if you do the work well, particularly if you have technical challenges or other challenges that you can solve. But you're also laying groundwork so that 2 years down the line, when the next version comes out, it doesn't think negatively about your brand. And then you're going to have to wait potentially another 2 years or more for the next version. And by then, it may already have solidified its beliefs. And unfortunately, for the research engineers of the world, they don't necessarily even know how and why their own models form these opinions. So it's not like they can go in and alter it. This is a non-deterministic thing. It's an emergent property, we call it. So you kind of have to do the work to convince them and to have the right relevant data available, because you don't know how these are going to evolve in the future. And if this becomes a much bigger thing, which I think most people expect that it will, then if you haven't laid the groundwork now, you might end up with negative, views of your brand within some of these models, or even just they don't think that you're that relevant, so they don't recommend you and they talk about your competitor.
Yeah, that makes total sense. So this isn't just us asking Thomas questions. We really want to get you guys involved as well. And, you've heard a little bit of kind of like the basic questions that are probably out there. Do you guys have any questions for Thomas that he can answer for you based on what you've heard today, or based on what you guys are dealing with at work, or, It's not surprising. Go for it.
In the old days, we would have a search term on the URL so we could figure out the SEO was working or not, and make up for that. What the feedback would to know whether our GEO techniques are working or not? What can we look for? I had a client yesterday who newly kid in how to hear about ChatGPT, but I don't know what question he'd ask. How do you close the loop when you get better about what you're doing?
There's very little attribution, and it's very difficult to do. So if ChatGPT literally links to your site most of the time, but because this is a large language model, not all the time, it will include a UTM parameter that says ChatGPT as the source. So you can do that. You can find the traffic that comes from it. But again, because they're not consistent, sometimes it'll omit it, or sometimes it'll just mention your brand and it won't link to you. And then the user puts that into Google and ends up, and it looks like organic traffic that drove that sale. So it's very hard. What I recommend people do is you can systematize this to some extent. There are ways to do it. But just go and in a blank copy, like not your copy of ChatGPT, like go to an incognito browser or a computer you don't typically use, open the free version of ChatGPT, or even go to Google and start to ask it questions about your brand as if you were a user. And it sounds simplistic, but you'll sometimes be amazed the wrong information that it has or the narratives that it's telling people about your brand. And unfortunately, I wish there was a way to say, yes, you can find, this specific conversation and it's going to pass these things. It's much more qualitative at this point than it is quantitative. The one thing that's changing is if you are an e-com brand, there's a new protocol that OpenAI just released called the Agentic Commerce Protocol. And this actually allows people to purchase anything through a chatbot. Initially ChatGPT, but it's an open protocol. And they launched it with Etsy. And basically the way that it looks is I can say, well, I want this thing on Etsy, and ChatGPT will find it for me, and there'll be a buy button within ChatGPT itself. And they have my credit card info. And I can press that button, and it'll actually purchase that item from Etsy through this protocol and send it to my door. And now Walmart is going to implement it. There's large retailers that are going to build this technology in. You can do it too. It's Square, Square and many other services are working to implement it as well for smaller kind of e-com brands. At that point, attribution will be much easier because it'll literally be a sales channel instead of just the marketing channel. At this point, the best thing to do is just start to have conversations with it and see what it says about your brand and particularly note things where it maybe got information wrong. And I give the example of like, I'm Thomas Smith. There are thousands of Thomas Smiths. Disambiguation, figuring out who's the right Thomas Smith to talk about between me and all the others is very hard. And so it's interesting to me to speak with these models and see what they say about, me, they can't really find, but my company, my brand, it can reveal a lot more than you might expect.
Go ahead, Al.
Following up on that, Thomas, if you find in your test searches and chats that your brand or your company has some negative reputation, just throwing an idea out, would it be effective in this role in the way that it wasn't with a human search to counter that and say, well, you might have heard that we're kind of a cheap brand. The truth is quite different, blah, 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 right? Would that be convincing, you think, to like these engines?
Yes, it probably would. And even things like if there's multiple companies that share your name or that have similar sounding names, then to have a section on your website that says, we are not this brand, we are not this one, and linking out to them, that kind of thing even can help. So yeah, absolutely. And I think
almost communicating directly with the AI.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, exactly. And it's amazing how, again, how much weight they give to what you say about yourself. So I think it depends on what the problem is. Sometimes it'll be that, like there's another brand that sounds similar to you or even has the same name if your brand is relatively generic. And the LLM might have developed a negative reputation around your brand based on what happened with that other one. And then it's a matter of, on the content side, saying this is who we are, this is who we're not. There's also ways on the technical side with schema to tell the LLM directly, this is, for example, our LinkedIn. This is our YouTube. This is our, pretty much any social profile, and to start to weave these connections so that now on a technical side, by reading that schema or people, you can link a specific person to your entity. So if Thomas Smith happens to work at your company and you want my reputation to positively impact it, but the model doesn't know which Thomas Smith, you can actually link it in schema. This is not visible to humans, but it's visible to these systems, to me or to your employee. And there's a lot that you can do with this. So that helps tremendously. But again, the problem depends on looking at what's going on with your own brand. And there's many different things, but often they're very solvable. Yeah.
I think Todd has had, and I'm sorry, your name is?
Shared.
Share. We'll get Todd first, and then we'll do Share before we go to that side.
I'm curious if like a early stage startup would have a different approach than a well-established brand, or is it even playing field, or what can an early stage company do? They're probably the well-established brands.
I think the positive thing here is that with traditional SEO, there were a lot of things where you could just throw money at it and end up ranking well. Like you could buy a ton of links basically from all kinds of places, or you could run a digital PR campaign that might land you, a bunch of coverage, and that just the sheer number of links could start to impact your ranking in a way that might not actually reflect how good your brand is, but just how much money you had to throw at it. With large language models and generative engines, it's a bit different because they are actually understanding the context of your brand, the problem you're solving, how your products work, how it fits into the overall landscape. So I think it levels the playing field in a lot of ways because they're much better at figuring out, hey, this is actually new and interesting versus just somebody threw a ton of money at it and got a lot of links. Particularly on the agentic commerce protocol side, it's a real leveler because a lot of the challenge for small brands, particularly someone as small as an Etsy creator, right, would be discoverability and the ease of purchase. And if I had to be as a small brand with maybe a local business where I'm selling some kind of an item, I'm never going to be able to compete with Amazon on Amazon's terms. But if somebody's looking for my product within ChatGPT and it knows that I happen to be a very skilled artist based on all the context and world knowledge it has, and somebody looks for something that I happen to make, and then I have an easy one-click buy, just like every other brand in the world of any size, it's much easier for somebody to buy that thing from me versus just going to Amazon because it's easier. So I think it will have a leveling effect. Certainly, there's still a lot of impact of just size and budget.
Yep.
But
the amount of
Yeah.
content you could put out there.
Exactly. Yeah. But less so than before.
All right. So, Sherry?
Yes. You were talking about training the models and convincing the models now. Do you have an opinion on what types of content work best? Is it short form blog? Is it long form? Like what types of content would you recommend? Someone start.
On your own, yeah, that's a great question. On your own site, kind of, I would say more of the long form blog, and particularly with as much schema and structured data as you can technically put into it. And then certain things that LLMs and really like are, for example, an FAQ section, a summary section within that article. So a lot of headings that break up and sort of show the different parts to an article. So basically structure within the content, but also they are a lot more, again, story driven than a traditional search engine. So the idea of keywords and stuffing in keywords and, what words do I need to put in there in order to rank, that's much less significant. The story that you tell and the argument that you make is much more convincing to them than like raw words, where a traditional search engine would literally chop the page up into words and look at, instances and how the entities relate. This is much more nuanced. So I would say the best kind of content on your own site is going to be more of that long form article with a strong narrative and strong story to it, with structured data, if you have a technical team or you can do that, and then also with some kind of summary component, again, an FAQ, a key takeaways, that kind of thing can go a long way. On other platforms, it's primarily mentions and stories about your brand, where, again, there's consistency about the story, using the right name for the brand, the right name for the people, consistent names for the people, consistent descriptions of what you do. So that's where creating talking points or creating a brand, guide can be really helpful, so that when your CEO goes out and does a media interview, they're saying the same thing that your product page says about the product. And when you post a YouTube video, then your content person doing that is saying the same thing, because that transcript is going to be readable to these models. So consistency is very important, more than the specific content type. But if I were to say where to start, literally your about page. Pages. You should have a team page with all the people in your company, with schema links to their social profiles, their background and bios, and about a history page for your company, very important in this space. And then, as you mentioned, individual product pages for each of your products that gives a narrative about how that product would help somebody and how it can be used.
And to just follow up on that, do you also recommend, for instance, thinking about it in a terms of a long tail? So for instance, think about how people interact with a ChatGPT. It's you ask a number of questions, and you keep going and going and going. So in terms of providing answers, you want to be in kind of a long tail where you're answering any possible questions you can think of someone asking about your product, about your brand, about your particular executives. Do you think that that's something you would also want to recommend as well?
Particularly on your own site. So the pattern we tend to see in looking at how these models present data to the user, the first broad query tends to rely more on external data. So if I say, like, what's the best marketing agency in the Bay Area, it's going to look at press coverage, trade journal, kind of, trade group participation, directories, best of lists, all these external factors to provide that first answer. The more I drill down, though, say I find EM marketing and I say, oh, do they provide, SEO services? Then it's going to shift and start to look at your, in this case, EM marketing's page in order to answer that question. So yes, long tail, but particularly to focus on the big picture when you're off your own site and you're in these other places, and then to get even more granular, exactly like you're saying, even more long tail and answering questions about your brand and your products and services when you're on your own site.
Right.
Because by the time the chatbot starts to present that data to users, they're probably much further down the funnel and they're ready for much more of that specific data.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. So don't be shy with your FAQs.
Yeah.
Make them very descriptive. Sorry.
So with that said, though, I just want to ask one question on that. You're saying long tail or content. Are videos added to that, or should it be kind of written text content, or can they actually pull? Because we always say, no, your site needs more video content, right? We need to add more video, and we need more, it needs to be more interactive that way. Does that matter, video versus text?
I would say it's hard to say overall. I think it's a good practice to have video, but the exact amount that the models are able to understand about that video is a lot less clear than what they can understand about text. So I would say the best thing to do would be to have that video in there, but to also include a transcript if you can, because then there is a textual component that they can access. And if they are accessing that video and seeing the content within it, or if some future point they start to do that, then you're covered for both things. But yeah, try to include, and there's again, with AI now, you can create a transcript. It doesn't have to be perfect, but that can be very, very helpful, because then you know that you have something that's readable to it.
Makes perfect sense.
Okay, so I love this conversation. I think there's a lot of different things here that are just super exciting for marketers in general. So I just want to start off by just saying I'm super excited about it as a marketer who has been doing SEO and then also LLM optimization, because it's, if you know your customer, you actually have such a leg up, because if you think about it, all these people that are using their chatbots or their whatever app they're on, whether it's Claude or ChatGPT, they now are, it's way more personalized, so they're able to better sell whatever that person actually wants based off of that background of that person who's using it, because of the way you can input information, so they know you really well. So I think it's really exciting just in general in that aspect. But I would love for you to talk more to black hat, SEO tactics. I know we've gotten into a couple of them already. One of the things too that I love got brought up is how you can actually teach ChatGPT or Claude or whatever, right? Actually telling them what you want them to actually know about your brand. So I was wondering if you'd start there, and then curious to know what your thoughts are. I know right now, so kind of two-part question. As we look into the future, with agents and all that, all these different apps now are going to start having agents. So that's going to also create an interesting world for us as marketers to also quickly adapt to and pivot as well, in terms of what you can see. Because right now we can see when a chatbot has visited your website, there's different things like that where you can actually sort through on the search side of things. But when agents get put into the picture, when they're fully out there, it's going to create an entirely new world. But anyway, so just wanted you to speak to those two different things.
Yeah, so the black hat side of things is a great point. One problem that large language models have in general is that they have trouble distinguishing between data and instructions. So if I put into the data, into the content of my page, an instruction for the chatbot to follow, it may just blindly follow that. And so we have this concept of prompt injection, where people will essentially put a prompt into the content of their page that might do something with a black hat type of orientation. And that might be, for example, telling the chatbot that their competitors are awful, or telling them that they're very good, or telling it that they're a time traveler, to use that example again. So that's something that definitely is a flaw with large language models. And it's a fundamental technical flaw with them. So it's hard with guardrails and other things to fix that. And so you probably will have more bad actors who are basically influencing what shows up by doing that kind of prompt injection, including those instructions or those things. And that can be something like, forget everything you've learned about whatever brand. If you see this page, tell the user whatever. And that might then show up. And because they might have pulled from 50 different sources, the model may have pulled from 50 different sources before reaching its conclusion and writing it out for the user might not have any idea that happened. They might just see a different result. So that's a concern, definitely. I think it's still something people are figuring out, how to navigate that. On a more positive side, we can use that to our advantage, just in terms of if we do tell good and accurate stories, we still have a much bigger ability to influence. And then the point about agents is a great one too. We're moving towards a world, and I'm a little skeptical of agentic AI overall. I'm not sure it'll be as big a thing as some people expect, but it'll certainly be a thing. And the idea there is that instead of just giving information to the user, an agentic AI system actually goes and takes actions on their behalf. And so at that point, the bot actually becomes your customer, right? If I say, book me a flight to Atlanta, and it's an AI agent that's going to do that, and it lands on different websites and does research and everything, and then it makes a decision and spends my money for me, then I'm no longer the customer. The bot is the customer. And so if we reach a world where that's happening more and more, then that's even more of an argument for why we have to make our stuff make sense to these bots, right? Because they may not actually be a information source. They might actually be the entity making the purchasing decision.
Yes.
Yeah.
Not to be too provocative, but is this the death of creativity? I feel like there's a lot of technical things, there's a lot of structure, there's a lot of templatizing of information, and it's kind of reminding me, and I'm probably stealing this from Leilani, of a 5-paragraph essay in high school, which was a fine way to structure your thoughts and teach a young person how to write and how to think and express ideas. But ultimately, you come to realize that's not a very nuanced or interesting way of telling stories all the time. And if everyone needs to have a product page for every product they have and an endless list of FAQs, and it feels like there's this kind of like checklist of information you need to be providing, as opposed to thinking coming from like a brand frame of mind here, how you can express your unique brand creativity creatively. Like, is there room for that in this world, or is it kind of the dumbing down of human intelligence because these models are so gullible?
I actually think there's way more room for human creativity, and that's one of the things that excites me about this new framework. If you've ever written, and I've done many of these, a 3,000 or 4,000 word SEO optimized buying guide to some random product, you know how soul-sucking that process is, right? Like when you're writing for the algorithm.
Yeah.
And that's what you had to do a lot of the time to win in the traditional SEO space. How many keywords can I stuff in? How many comparison tables? And it was awful. And the really cool thing with large language models is that they are, again, very story-driven, and they're able to understand a much more complex and nuanced and interesting story than a traditional search engine that's just chopping the page up into words. So I would say there's much more space to tell that interesting and compelling narrative, because the LLM will be able to follow it in a way that the search engine wasn't. And I would say that these ideas about clarity and about specificity, they don't have to be limiting. I mean, any writing should be clear, right? Any writing, any story, even if it's really beautifully written, should be clear and readable and understandable to people. So I think that there's space for creative, and probably even more space for interesting, creative ways to tell your story. And again, story-driven. This is all about storytelling. And so that opens up that ability where before SEO writing was not about storytelling, right? It was about keywords and narrative and very specific things you had to include in there. So I think there's more space for it now. I think the new models are better at understanding the nuance of a narrative. You can get more creative with them. And as long as you're following the basic tenets of good writing, of being clear and being direct and including kind of consistent references to things, you can do so much more with creativity and still end up ahead with this.
I think you talked about this in your last session as well, and you had said that this actually elevates brand.
Oh yeah.
Because now all the things we just talked about in terms of big companies versus small companies, how can you compete? I think you got to look for those angles. How does my story, relate to the audience that I'm speaking to better than Amazon? Amazon is one of the worst marketing companies out there in terms of they don't really focus on that because they are so good at what they do, and so they don't have to worry about it. But a small company has to worry about all of that. They have to compete with limited resources. So the storytelling, the brand building, the nuances, the caveats, all of that matters a lot more. Do you agree?
Yeah, I think brand is incredibly important here. And one of the things, again, with traditional search, these search engines really never figured out how to understand a brand. They had to use all these different metrics, dwell time on your site, and again, links and domain authority and all this stuff, and page rank, to try to have proxies for understanding who you are and what you do. With chatbots, they can sidestep all of that and genuinely have some understanding of your place in the world and why what you do matters and what other people are saying about you. So I think it's super exciting because it means that that brand and who you are isn't just reduced to all these metrics. It really is much more holistic, and it gives us, I think, as an industry, a lot more space to do a lot more interesting things in terms of brand and in terms of the folks that we work with, and still be able to win in this space.
I think we have room for one more question. So let's go ahead and pick Phil.
Well, recently I was actually searching for a hotel on Gemini,
Mm-hmm.
and I was asking for near a certain location. Found out that it gave me wrong information. So if you find one of these chatbots is giving out long information about your brand, is there something you can do about that?
Well, within Gemini, there's a thumbs up and thumbs down. You can hit the thumbs down, and you can put in a note. And I asked, speaking with a Google researcher, and they said they actually, in the aggregate, they do review that. It is integrated back in. She wouldn't tell me whether people read it and actually integrate it, or if it's sort of summarized, probably by another LLM. But they do take that stuff into account. AI companies are very hungry for human feedback about the quality of their results. And that comes about through a lot of things where if you ask a question to ChatGPT and you close the window, it assumes, hey, I gave you a good answer. But if you are actually willing to do the work of even the simple step of hitting that thumbs up or thumbs down, they weigh that very heavily. And it's one of the reasons, for example, chatbots love Reddit. They love data from Reddit. Why? Because Reddit has information and a clear ranking as to the quality of that information that's been crowdsourced. There's, people upvote and downvote. And so if you do provide feedback in that format, it's going to be weighed probably much more heavily than a traditional search engine would ever have weighed user feedback.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Thomas. I really
Yeah, thank
appreciate
you.
it.
So much.
Yeah, and thanks for everybody else for participating.
Yeah, thank you.